Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today. As we approach the one-year mark of the Biden presidency, we're excited to put together two panels of experts to help us reflect on President Biden's first year in office. The president assumed office amidst a deep political crisis, an unprecedented public health crisis, a self-induced economic coma, and a nationwide racial justice reckoning. And of course, the president was sworn in on January 20th, just 2 weeks after the January 6th insurrection, which were, in the words of former Republican Governor Chris Christie, a violent attack on the Capitol and an attempt to overturn the 2020 election. So while all transitions are unique, this was a first year unlike any other. I believe it fair to say that no newly elected or re-elected president has simultaneously faced so many crises at once. As most of you know, we take first years very seriously at the Miller Center. Presidential first years are a time when an administration assembles its team, establishes its processes for governing, identifies its priorities, and also weathers a series of crises when the world tests a new commander-in-chief. A new president can exercise the most political capital during that first year, after which attention turns toward the midterms on Capitol Hill. That's particularly the case when the president's party controls both houses of Congress. But presidents are also at the bottom of a steep learning curve, including on the foreign policy side. Success depends on quickly building a strong and experienced team that works well together, and transitions matter. There are strong reasons for the outgoing and incoming presidents to cooperate. Even without the January 6th insurrection, the last transition was among the lowest points in that kind of cooperation, at least as difficult as the transition from Buchanan to Lincoln or Hoover to FDR. And that's particularly the case when presidents are facing national security or economic crises in the first year, right when they're still learning on the job. Today's two panels will explore and assess President Biden's first year through these domestic and foreign policy lenses. I'm really pleased to introduce our first panel on the domestic side. Guian McKee is an associate professor in presidential studies here at the Miller Center. Guian's research focuses on how federal policy, especially in the executive branch, plays out at the local level in American communities. He's currently working on a book project that examines the rise of the healthcare economy in American cities after World War II. And he's an expert in our presidential recordings program on the Lyndon Johnson presidency, among others, where in 1964, and then again in Johnson's second first year in 1965, Johnson, and working with Congress, enacted major reforms such as the Voting Rights and Civil Rights Bill and Medicare and Medicaid. Katie Dunn-Tempest is a non-resident senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and a practitioner senior fellow at the Miller Center. She's a scholar of the American presidency, focusing on White House staffing, presidential transitions, and the intersection of politics and policy in the presidency. She is also the host and publisher of the White House Transition Tracker at the Miller Center, which tracks the background and tenure of White House officials. Valerie Smith Boyd is the director for the Partnership for Public Services Center for Presidential Transition, a center that we at the Miller Center love to partner with. She leads the partnership's efforts to support successful transition planning for current and future presidential administrations. She has had a long public service career, having served in the past 3 administrations in both career and political roles. And last, but certainly not least at the Miller Center, is Josh Bolten, who's the president and CEO of the Business Roundtable and served as the White House Chief of Staff for President George W. Bush. Regularly cited by people from both parties, not just as a great chief of staff, but as a leading public servant, Josh has been the director of the Office of Management and Budget, as well as having served at the State Department, USTR, and Senate Finance Committee. He also has extensive non-governmental experience, including as the interim CEO of the One Campaign, on whose board he still serves. He also oversaw the very successful handoff from President Bush to President Obama in 2009 amidst the global financial crisis. The conversation will be moderated by my colleague and friend Ian Solomon, Dean of UVA's Frank Batten School of Leadership and Public Policy. Ian has his own extensive background in the academy and in public service, including having worked at Yale Law School, having taught at the University of Chicago School of Law, and having worked on Senator Barack Obama's staff and in the White House, in the Obama Treasury Department, and also as the U.S. representative to the World Bank. Before I hand it over to Ian, I want to welcome in particular students from a January term class I've been teaching on the Biden first year, which is co-listed in the Batten School and in UVA's College of Arts and Sciences. For the last 2 weeks, we have been meeting by Zoom with a range of Democratic and Republican public servants, White House officials, members of Congress, think tank representatives, journalists. The class includes students from the Batten School and the college, and I've been just thrilled to be part of this along with my co-instructor and Miller Center Governing Council member, Dave Burke. We know you students are out there, so please send your questions in. Ian will do his best to field them and incorporate them into the session. So with that, Ian, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Bill, so much for that introduction. And thank you for the Miller Center's leadership in putting this event together. It is an honor to be asked to moderate this discussion with such terrific panelists, and it's great to have our J-term students joining us. I want to dive right into our discussion of Biden's first year, which has come down to its final week. But I'll start by saying, do we all remember 2020? Now, that was a hard year, challenging for so many reasons. I recall people a year ago praying just to turn the page on 2020, to get it over with. 2021 was going to be such a relief and a much better year. Many people had very high expectations for 2021, high expectations about our politics, our public health situation, our economy, working and family lives, our social lives, going to the movies. And yet, many of my friends and colleagues believe that 2021 was an even more challenging year than 2020. Even with the change of presidential administration, the discovery of multiple effective vaccines, economic interventions to support American families and dramatically reduce poverty, 2021 was perceived by many to be a very challenging year as well. And that hard year also applies to President Biden's first year in office. So the Quinnipiac University poll released yesterday showed that Biden enjoyed approval of only 33% of the American adults, with 53% disapproving. 33% approval is a tough report card. It was a challenging first year for many reasons, many of which, as Bill mentioned, were inherited, of course, but that comes with the job. So for the next hour, we're going to focus on the domestic affairs and priorities, and the first part will be a conversation among panelists, and then we'll turn to the audience for some Q&A. Well, to get this discussion started, I want to ask the entire panel to briefly share a few of the factors that they believe may have made this a uniquely challenging first year. Katie, maybe I can ask you to kick it off with some of your thoughts.
Yeah, well, I'll kind of take it chronologically. And I think the first thing I would point out is, as soon as President Biden was inaugurated, the level of acrimony in the nation's capital and across the country was at an all-time high. And for the remainder of that year, former President Trump continued to question the election results, to continue to question the validity of this presidency. And that can't help anything, right? The second thing is that our hopes were up very high once the vaccine was found and the distribution of the vaccine went well. People thought we were pretty much done with COVID. And obviously it's turned out that's definitely not the case. And so I think raising people's hopes up and then expectations up and then have them dive down has not been good. The third thing I would point is just the difficulty with the Senate. President Biden has had difficulty getting his legislative pillars passed by the Senate. And in addition to that, and mostly from my perspective, because I study staffing, the Senate has moved at a snail's pace on many of the nominations. And that has made it difficult for President Biden to get his staff in place. And one of the best powers and the biggest powers that you have as a new president is to staff the government and to put roughly 4,000 individuals that respect you, that want to work for you, that are qualified into these jobs. And of those, roughly 1,200 are Senate confirmed, and it's really moved at a snail's pace. I did a study looking at the 100, 200, and 300 day points, and at 300 days, there were only 100 individuals confirmed by the Senate, and that includes the cabinet members. So that was a very poor showing, and that makes it hard to move your agenda forward.
Super. Thank you, Katie. Josh, what might you add to Katie's list?
I don't think I can add to Katie's list. It's the right list, and I would focus on, in particular, the character of the national politics with which President Biden has had to deal in his first year. I mean, having a 33% approval rating is bad, but it's not that unusual. I mean, you all are wondering, what's gone wrong with Biden that he has 33% approval. I served as chief of staff during George W. Bush's second term, and I'm wondering what's his secret? Because we had approval ratings that fell at one point substantially below that 33% level. But we were also operating, and remember now, this is only 15 years ago, we were also operating in a political environment in which that there was some plasticity to it. George W. Bush, in the immediate aftermath of the 9/11 attack, had support from 90-some% of the American population. He had one of the highest approval ratings in the history of approval ratings. And it's hard to imagine any set of circumstances in which any leader of either party could get substantially above 50%. And so I think what we have to focus on as the main feature and maybe the main challenge in our politics today is the polarization and division that, while it's not unprecedented in our history, seems so sticky.
Thank you, Josh. Valerie, what would you add to that?
Sure, Ian. A couple more things to say related to COVID are that the economic downturn presented a policy challenge for the candidates and the new administration to manage. And the transition to remote work happened right at the outset of transition planning, and we're all used to it now, but it presented an early and ongoing challenge for Biden's transition team to coordinate with federal agencies and amongst themselves. Of course, the summer of 2020 was also marked by the racial reckoning and the national conversation that provoked, and the examination of our priorities. So across the board, 2020 was an incredibly challenging year to conduct a transition.
And 2021. Yeah. Gian, any additions?
I'll add two, I guess. To start by picking up about on the points about polarization and the Senate, I'll just note that this is only the fourth time in American history that a president has taken office with an evenly divided Senate. And so it's obviously not completely unique, but it is rare. And I think it's really important to note how challenging that is in this environment where it's so hard to get cooperation from the other side, regardless of party, and just that there's no margin for error in the Senate in an environment where you have the filibuster and the narrow path of budget reconciliation to pass major legislation. The other observation that I've made over this year, and I think it's not entirely new, but it's really become apparent, is a growing separation between policy and political returns. Now, does a president now get credit from the public from passing something like the infrastructure bill or the American Rescue Plan? It's not entirely clear that Biden has. And so I think that's an interesting phenomenon to consider, what's going on there in our political culture that separated a president's popularity from what he might actually accomplish legislatively.
A lot there. Yes.
Right. And Ian, the other thing I might add to that is that you have to, I think, also remember that expectations are so high for any new president, and particularly in the aftermath of the Trump administration, where people were basically worn out by sort of controversy after controversy, firing after firing. People's expectations were high for a return to normalcy. There was, unified government with Democrats in control of both chambers, even though it was very narrow in the Senate. And I think part of it is managing those expectations. And it's difficult to do because Americans' expectations of what presidents can do and new presidents can do is completely out of whack with what they actually can do. And so if you look at first years of lots of presidents, it's very difficult to have major legislative breakthroughs. So in some ways, we should actually be, or observers should actually be sort of surprised that the infrastructure bill got through, surprised that the American Rescue Plan got through, surprised that President Biden got more judicial nominees through than many of his predecessors and set records in that regard. So, it's a little bit about managing expectations, which are unrealistic. And if you figure out how to manage them, let me know.
Well, part of managing expectations, I assume, starts with the transition process itself. So maybe I could turn to you, Valerie, as an expert on presidential transition studies and the Center for Presidential Transition Studies, to think about, how would you assess the last transition? And in your view, how did the transition affect the first year in office and expectations?
So I would completely agree with Katie that we all owe each other a little bit of grace and expectations for our first year. But we could assess the transition based on three factors: the Biden transition team, the Trump White House, and federal agencies. And the Biden team set themselves the task of creating the best transition team in history in some of the worst circumstances imaginable. And they succeeded in doing an impressive job in following some best practices that we've all been talking about for many years now, in terms of starting early and deferring to the campaign to set the agenda. And they also looked at some of the newer challenges and made deliberate decisions on how to confront them, such as grouping policy issues by their policy review teams into issue sets instead of narrowly focused silos, and integrating technology planning into each policy area so that implementation of a new policy was a factor in consideration. And importantly, looking at the delays in the Senate confirmation process and planning their personnel structure around getting the maximum number of people they could in place on day one. So a lot of strengths on the Biden transition team. For the Trump White House, of course, the national discussion focuses around the outgoing president's reaction to the election results, and that was a defining factor in making this the most challenging transition in modern history. But I would be remiss if I didn't say that there were dedicated public servants like Deputy Chief of Staff Chris Liddell, who ensured that the requirements of the Presidential Transition Act were met, and ensured that there was information sharing on national security and COVID and other priorities. And finally, on federal agencies, the career executives who have developed expertise over several cycles now are one of the great strengths of the system, and dealt in their own ways with the very challenging circumstances very admirably. So taking all of that to look at how the transition impacted the President Biden's first year, the transition team successfully laid a fairly strong groundwork, I would argue. First on policy, setting up executive orders and for things like the American Rescue Plan, getting vaccine distribution plans together and out early. And then on personnel, which I know we'll dive into more, to get a record number of appointees in place on day one and by day 100. So there are challenges as well in terms of the outgoing administration. OMB's posture was a significant factor in the delay in getting out of budget after President Biden took office, but there are a lot of successes to point.
Great. Well,
Ian, can I throw in an amen to that, having experienced several transitions in and out of the White House. First of all, to say that the operation that Valerie now runs at the Partnership for Public Service is performing itself a really important public service in focusing some professionalism, some history, and some attention on what is for the United States a very vulnerable period now. When basically we decapitate government and expect a whole new crew to take over in a way that really no other democracy in the world much less the most important democracy in the world, has to undergo. So kudos to the Partnership for Public Service, and kudos to the Miller Center also for focusing on these issues, which I continue to believe don't get enough focus. Second, an amen for Valerie's shout out to some of the unfortunately small number of heroes inside the Trump administration who tried to do the right thing, while a large proportion of that administration was trying to undermine the transition. Maybe out of a sincere belief that the president, the incoming president, was illegitimately elected, but that's got to be regarded as a hopefully bizarre anomaly in the history of our country. I participated in the transition from the Clinton administration into the Bush administration in 2001. And that was a case where a very substantial proportion of the country felt that because the election was so close and because there were disputed votes in Florida, that President Bush was not legitimately elected. But everybody I dealt with in the Clinton administration behaved completely professionally, and beginning with the very gracious concession of Vice President Gore at a time when he could have kept the dispute going, but for the good of the country, he didn't, in a circumstance where it was genuinely close. And what we've been through is an election that was not close, where the result was obvious, and yet we had a president who animated all of his supporters and his own administration to resist the democratic process, and that's got to be regarded as a very discouraging outlier in the history of our country. And I think the challenge for all of us is how to prevent that kind of thing from happening again.
Right. Thank you, Josh. Staying on this question of personnel, I wonder if, Katie, you could talk about it from a historical perspective, not just the last few administrations, but even more broadly about the number of Senate confirmed appointees, for example. How are we doing? And what are the implications for how we're doing for the ability to carry out public policy and protect the nation's security?
That's a great question. And I think the way I would approach it is, I thought of three nouns that really describe the staffing system at the moment: speed, diversity, and stability. Speed, as Valerie mentioned as well, after all of the inauguration festivities, they swore in over 1,100 individuals to serve in roles across the federal government. And that is more than double what Obama and Trump did. So what they did in one administration was more than two different presidents had done. And that was just astounding. They hit the ground running. Most of their cabinet was confirmed by March of 2021. And then I would say after that, that's when things really started to slow down. And if you look at a longitudinal analysis of the pace of Senate confirmations, what you find is that ever since President Reagan, the pace gets slower and slower and slower. And one might have thought, because the Biden personnel operation was so professional, their recruitment, they had worked on it for months because of the transition and their well-organized transition, one might have thought that, wow, they're going to have more nominees than Trump had. Well, actually, it was very difficult for them to even meet the Trump benchmarks at the 100, 200, and 300 day point. And I contend that wasn't really a Biden problem. That was the Senate working very slowly on these nominations. And as I mentioned, after 300 days, there was only 140 individuals confirmed. And there's roughly 1,200 Senate confirmed jobs. So that's not a very good performance. And if we go at that pace, we're not even going to get a sole slate of nominees after 4 years done. So that's not good. On the bright side, the diversity is historically off the charts. I have a website on the Miller Center site called the Biden Top 100, where I created and curated a list of the top 100 staffers. And of those 100 staffers, a full 57% are women. So 57 are women and 38% are non-white. And when you compare that to other administrations, it literally is just off the charts. you might remember at various points across the campaign, he made a commitment about and spoke about diversity in the campaign. And I would say this is a promise he has already filled, and he did so with great vigor. And then finally, I wanted to talk a little bit about the stability, because in the aftermath of the Trump administration, where I was kept very busy because I analyzed turnover, this first year has been a pleasure. The turnover has been very low. In fact, it looks like President Biden's turnover will be the third lowest if you go all the way back to President Reagan. It's been very stable. There have been some departures at the highest level in the White House, but not very many. There have been no cabinet departures. And again, I think this speaks to Valerie's points about the professionalism of the transition, as well as the deep, deep bench of federal government experience. In that study that I've done for the Miller Center, I did some research about whether these staffers had worked in prior administrations or for the federal government. And 77% of them had prior government experience. And that experience matters. I've participated in a lot of oral histories where you ask people about what it was like in those early days in the White House, and they say it's chaos and that nothing can prepare you for the job. Well, you can be prepared for the job if you've worked for other presidents, and that goes a long way, especially during that first year. So that's the way I would sort of put it in history and characterize it broadly.
Thank you, Katie. So Josh, the first time in the White House, it's chaos. What was it like in your time, and how would you compare your time to now?
It's always a little chaotic. I mean, something for really for everybody who's never been through it to appreciate is that, especially at the White House, and really uniquely at the White House, the government empties out. I mean, I've participated in two transitions out. And it's extraordinary if you happen to have the privilege of being in the West Wing on the night of January 19th, the night before the inauguration. I've done it twice. You get a chance to walk around the West Wing, and there is no one in any office. There's nothing on the desks except maybe a computer. There's nothing on the shelves. And there's a few officials around. There's a few people around in the Situation Room who are typically relatively junior staff officers and communicators. The White House mess people are still there to serve food, but everything else is gone. And the new team walks in, presumably as soon after noon as they can manage to make their way through the gate, and they're starting with a blank slate. That's why when I referenced the good work that the Partnership for Public Service is doing, that they've constructed something of a playbook that helps those people be as prepared as possible. But even if you've been through that transition before, imagine whatever business you're in, and all of a sudden at noon on a particular day, you and hundreds of your colleagues are experiencing your first day, and you've got to keep the operation going at the level that the most complicated and greatest country in the world needs to have going, and that's not easy for anybody. So it shouldn't be underestimated what a complicated and vulnerable moment that is for the United States. My own experience, though, Ian, was pretty good, because we had what Katie was talking about, is that we had a number of people with a lot of experience in government already coming into those roles. And equally importantly, we, most of us in the senior part of President Bush's team had experience working with each other. So we had roles either previously in government or on the campaign where we had worked with each other. We knew what each other's roles were. And a lot of that comes from the top. If the president doesn't care about order, there'll be chaos. And if the president wants chaos, there'll be extreme chaos. So it matters a lot, not just the people that the president puts in place, but the kind of tone that the president sets from day one. And it doesn't need to be as quite as helter skelter as some administrations have started out.
So you asked us to imagine running a business at noon on January 20th. But you also now work for their Business Roundtable. And I'm wondering, are there private sector insights that might be useful here? Because clearly the importance of previous government service to ensure continuity and people who know what they're doing. Are there things we can borrow or learn or warnings from the private sector?
Well, I can tell you that the organization that I now work for is the Business Roundtable, which is a group of 235 CEOs of America's biggest companies. And I can tell you that to a person, they are startled when I describe the process of transition, in which they really can't imagine their headquarters building of their organization, which they mostly run big companies, typically about 100,000 employees. The government is several million employees. And they just can't imagine the concept that on a certain day at noon, the headquarters building would be empty, and you would walk into an empty office with a clean desk and say, "Please run this business." So that's we put a huge burden on our presidents, especially in the first year. But there are a lot of business principles that can be well applied during that first year. The most important one just being get your organization focused on your priorities. Make those priorities clear and empower the people to make that happen. In the case of the administration I worked in, the president the candidate Bush had a campaign book that had all of his priorities listed with some detail on the policies. We all took that book with us into the first weeks of the administration, and we knew what we were supposed to be doing because it had been part of what was campaigned on. And I return to the question that Gian was asking at the outset, which is, if candidates no longer campaign on policy proposals or don't get credit for the policies they pursue, that's a recipe for some pretty severe chaos in the early years or early months of an administration.
Well, thank you for that, Josh. Gian, let me bring you into this conversation as the historian on the panel. Looking at the first year in a broader historical context, it didn't feel like a typical presidential first year given the number of challenges and the virus. But how do you assess the priorities outlined by the administration, both in the campaign and since inauguration?
Yeah, when I think about historical analogies and how this presidency compares to earlier ones, I go back to the classic text on that subject by Ernest May and Richard Neustadt, and they emphasize thinking not just about similarities but about differences. And when I look at all of the factors that the Biden administration faced upon taking office this time, you can see elements of it in previous transitions and first years of one piece that might line up or another. But when you put the package of the pandemic and Trump disputing the election, the insurrection, and I think just we need to remember the levels of anger and grief, and I think even despair that Americans are feeling. The mountain for this administration has really been very high in a way that you can maybe pick out FDR and the Depression, maybe Lincoln and the Civil War, obviously. has some frightening similarities, but also anytime we go to the 19th century, the context is so different that it's hard to draw much. As to their priorities, I'd say a couple of things and how they've acted on their priorities. One observation I've made is that they probably overread the lessons of 2020 a little bit. And here I'm thinking about the pandemic and its dislocations, the George Floyd protests and the kind of social upheaval and the sense of change being imminent there. And then probably even the aftermath of January 6th, the anger against Trump and the victories in the Georgia Senate runoffs. And I think they maybe saw a bigger window and I think fell into an analogy trap here of thinking that Biden had a chance to be a transformative president on the model of an FDR or a Lyndon Johnson, as he looms over my shoulder here, and understating the difficulties that they actually face in a country as divided as this one. And as we said at the beginning, in a 50-50 Senate, how hard it was really going to be. To that point, I think some of the particular strategic choices may have been errors, although it's an easy case of looking back on to say things like, well, we should have Build Back Better up into many different bills. There were good reasons to do it as a single large bill. That said, with where things stand now, it seems that may have been a miscalculation. And I should say, I think many of the pieces of Build Back Better have a lot of value and would really help the lives of many Americans. And the problem with doing it in this big, large legislative package is they weren't able to distinguish those pieces. They weren't able to go out and fight the fight over the child tax care credit or expanded Obamacare subsidies or climate legislation. And they might very well have lost on those pieces too, but they would have established a political groundwork for what the administration stood for, what they were fighting to achieve, and possibly been in a better position today as a result. The other priority, of course, was the pandemic. And this is one of the areas where I'm actually probably most critical. They did a wonderful job in ramping up the vaccination effort. If you think back to where we were last December, there was a real question how quickly we could roll out the vaccines, given some of the technical challenges with the mRNA vaccines. And they really figured that out well. And did an excellent job there. I think as we hit that wall of vaccination, though, there was a little bit too much of a reliance on vaccination as the only tool. And here I think we get into some major failures on the part of the CDC and the FDA and the administrations. And it's a difficult challenge, but their ability to hit the balance between science and politics and bureaucratic interests within those agencies. And here I'm thinking about things like the rollout of vaccines for kids as the school year began, how slow that was, the difficulties in getting at-home tests and failing to prioritize that as a goal through the summer and fall when there was an opportunity to do so. The booster messaging, and this was a disaster, and this really does fall on those agencies. The political people actually had it right that boosters across the population were needed. And, this is the thing when you're going to be the party of government, you have to make government work on the most critical issues. I don't want to understate the challenges they faced. As I said, they were real, they were massive, but I think they needed to do better on a few of these. So I think that goes a long way to explaining where they are today.
So you talked about how perhaps they overread the lessons of 2020. I'm curious, quick answer here, because we have a bunch of questions starting to come in from the audience, but what will be the lessons from 2021 and the first year of the Biden administration that future presidents will take away? Valerie, thoughts on that?
Oh, I was still mentally back on lessons of 2020 and thinking about our comments at the top about the kind of political conversation in the country and how transitions have been in large part reliant on goodwill, and we want to foster an environment in the country that contributes to that goodwill going forward. But we've also been examining what are the appropriate ways to make the system less reliant on goodwill and have a strong infrastructure. But all of that does trend to the themes of 2021, and the news today. It's very fashionable to point to any discussion about a policy proposal as being dead on arrival or too hard to accomplish, and I would submit that it's not the right attitude to take toward the governing president. It is hard to do hard things, and we should work together to look at what support we can provide to accomplish them.
So we have a question from a student, Zach Russell, the student in the J-term class. And this gets to the point about expectations that people might have, or even their perception of objective reality. Is there some degree to which there's a rejection of objective reality that contributes to Biden's poor poll numbers, despite some notable policy achievements? So, Josh, is there a rejection of objective reality?
By whom?
By the general public, the people who respond to polling questions.
Yes, and that's what I was referring to in the and when I spoke at the outset about the stickiness of our politics, which is that we seem to be in a place in our society where everybody does get to have their own facts and reality, and there's a lot of reasons why that's come about, and just a big challenge for our society to get try to return to a place where there's a common agreement on the basic facts, even if there may be disagreement on what to do about them. And I commend the Miller Center for being at the center of trying to promote fact-based conversations. Ian, can I go back to your previous question for just 1 second and say that it may be true that the Biden administration overlearned the lessons of 2020. I think they also overlearned the lessons of 2009, and what I mean by that is that a lot of the senior folks in the Biden administration, many of whom were part of the Obama administration, and I'm with those on the panel who've also commended the Biden administration for having a strong roster of people with good experience in government. But what a lot of them took away from their experience in the Obama administration is that they didn't go big enough in responding to the economic crisis of 2009. They didn't try to cram through enough legislation in 2009. They didn't spend enough in 2009 in order to address the crisis, which would have made the entirety of the rest of the Obama 2 terms much easier, because they think it would have ameliorated the financial crisis. I'm skeptical about that premise, but in addition, one thing I am confident about is that one of the reasons why the Biden administration we see its approval rating so low, and it seems to be struggling in the way it is that there's a substantial portion of the country that feels like the Biden administration has left them behind. That Biden has turned on its head the usual mode that a new president operates under, which is that a president campaigns on animating his or her base and staking out positions that will garner a lot of support, and then once in governance, finds that he has to move back toward the center And
One of
Biden is.
our questions, though, Josh, suggests an alternative view of that. One of our questions from Jeffrey Krasny says maybe Biden has been too much of a senator trying to get along from a bipartisanship perspective. And maybe he'd be more effective if he'd adjusted as an executive as president, just making some decisions, taking some of those more extreme views. Thoughts on that from any of the panelists?
Yeah, I would just say that that's not the nature of the legislative process. The legislative process requires compromise. It requires collaboration. You can't just go there and say, I'm going to go big. I mean, you're just going to fail. You need to kind of read the room. You can't really sort of compare. There's no apples to apples here. You can't look back at the early years of the Bush administration or the Obama administration and say, well, we should learn this from them because this is what happened. We're in the midst of a pandemic. We're in the midst of high inflation. Like, it's not apples to apples. And so I think every new president has to come into office and assess things as they are then. And maybe you can look back. There are clearly things that the Biden people are doing that the Obama people didn't, especially in the realm of judicial nominations. But I just think you can't really replicate and say, well, the mistakes that President Bush made, we're not going to do that. We're going to do this differently, because it's just a completely different circumstance. So I think that we need to have respect and appreciation for how the legislative process works and how the president fits into that process, as opposed to thinking that the presidency is at the apex of our government and is in charge. There are 3 separate branches, and they need to work together, and they share, and they each have separate powers. And the system was designed with that in mind. It's not designed for an authoritarian type of president.
I would add that Biden fairly explicitly ran on the premise that he was somebody that could work across the aisle from his decades of experience in the Senate, and to have gone quickly, at least, into a mode of acting autonomously as the executive, taking lots of executive actions, would have really violated that. And while he would have had some support within his own party for the kind of policies that could have implemented, it would have had the same kind of alienation, I think, that Josh is talking about, or probably even worse. Secondly, I think one thing we've seen with the increased reliance on executive action by presidents is that it has, over time, vastly exacerbated polarization and centered polarization around the executive. Sid Milkis, my colleague here at the Miller Center, has written extensively about this. And I think it's a pretty clear phenomenon, and one that, well, presidents are often left with few options, is one that has had consequences that have been mixed to negative at best.
Other comments on executive orders, or executive versus more legislative governance?
I think those were really excellent analyses of the big picture. And I feel like on a smaller scale, I lived through the governing styles of 3 very different administrations. And, the last administration was known in some ways for being very decisive. And there were challenges with that approach. And with President Biden having a very collaborative approach, it presents a different set of challenges. It makes it harder to get things done when you're more concerned about having partners along the way. So it is hard to strike the balance between those two.
We have a question from Kurt Elward, who asked whether the panelists could speak more about the way President Biden has positioned himself for success in 2022, this next year, and what should he focus on going into year 2 of the administration? Katie?
Year 2 is very different. I actually spend some time studying the incentives that drive presidents in year 1 versus year 2 versus year 3 versus year 4. And year 1 is really kind of the time to get your legislative priorities passed through Congress, because year 2, in the next week or 2, everybody's just going to be thinking about the midterm elections. And everything that the president does going to be seen through the prism of politics. How might this particular decision affect the midterm election results, or the Senate race in this state, or the House race in this state? And so for people who are policy wonks, this isn't really the best time to be in the White House, because in many ways, the substantive aspects of governing get kind of overrun by the political considerations that occur. So how can he position himself? I think he's done the best he can in terms of staff-wise, personnel-wise, Hopefully the Senate will move a little bit more expeditiously on the nominations so that they can get more of their people in office. I think they've done an outstanding job in that respect. There are just so many things out of their control. What happens with the pandemic in the next 3 to 4 months? What happens with the economy in the next 3 to 4 months? So to the best they can, they need to sort of shape a message that emphasizes the achievements that they've made so far and what they plan to do in the future. But I think it's a really difficult time. There are hard waters to navigate because when everything is seen through the prism of the political implications, it just makes it hard to govern. It's more complicated.
Yeah, I'm wondering, though, whether there really was a point when politics were not driving the decision making. And one of the questions the students have asked relates to the political and policy debate between the two major pieces of legislation that kind of were on the table this past year, the infrastructure bill and the social infrastructure bill, as it were. And, previously, many Democrats said, don't pass the bipartisan infrastructure bill until the social bill gets passed. And yet the infrastructure bill was passed instead of the social bill. What's the future? Is there any, in the political context that plays out now, any chance for some of those social elements to get through?
Ian, I'll take that if I may. There's a chance that some of it will get through. Because there are a lot of popular policies there, not least on climate provisions. But the risk for the Biden administration, or the risk that they have realized in the gridlock they've now faced, is that they've overreached. And that they've tried to cram through too much of their agenda in a political context that Katie was talking about earlier, where it's not as though they're running a parliamentary government. I mean, everybody that's ever served in the White House ends up at some point with parliament envy, because you get to control both. At least while you're in power, you don't know how long you can stay in power, but while you're in power, you get to control both the executive and the legislative. Our system doesn't work that way, and it really doesn't work that way when you've got an evenly divided Senate. So I think the risk for the Biden administration always was overreaching. I think they have overreached. And I don't know whether there's much opportunity to recover for the Biden administration by Biden becoming more of the centrist president that people thought they were most people thought they were voting for when they elected him, or not. But that may be the only path to significant accomplishment in this second year, and especially in third and fourth years, when the president is likely to be facing at least a Republican House.
Agreement on that, or any, Ian?
I think it's going to be very interesting to see how relationships with Senator Manchin's office evolve in the coming months, because I do think simply at an interpersonal level, the relationships between Manchin and the White House staff in particular are fairly poisoned at the moment. They're all adults, they're all political professionals. It's possible they'll find those kind of deals, but when it rests on one or two senators, to the extent that it does, those kind of relationships are actually, tremendously important. So I think that's one thing to watch, is what kind of signals we get about that relationship just in the coming weeks, or maybe the next few months. But as Casey said, the window isn't long.
Thank you, Valerie.
Yeah, I would hope that there's the opportunity to pass these the elements of the social infrastructure bill. People across the spectrum have concerns about their economic needs and enfranchisement, and it is good politics, in addition to good substance, to provide the things that they're asking for. So I will be the Pollyanna in this conversation and hope for the best.
So We've talked a bit about the character of our politics and the need for some goodwill, not just in first years, but actually in getting through to other years. We talked about the challenge of expectations. We've talked about whether we can take lessons from the past or whether each situation is unique in the context of the pandemic or inflation. You know, as we think and as the students listen to this panel and other Miller Center supporters and Baton School supporters listening on this conversation, what advice do we give to future leaders about how to prepare for taking office, how to prepare for leading? Are there structural changes we need to make in who we require Senate confirmation for, in how we assess what the expectations of our leaders are, and how we put forth political platforms? What's most salient to you as we come within the next week to the end of this year at a critical time for American democracy? What stands out as the key lessons for us to take forward as educators, as citizens, as people who care about this country?
I would say that it's about tempering expectations and maybe having a deeper appreciation. And this sounds, very ivory tower, but having a deeper appreciation for how the government works, and therefore tempering your expectations as to what a new administration can actually accomplish. Particularly at a period in American history where we're suffering with a pandemic that is actually affecting every country across the world. And everyone's trying to figure out how to respond to it and how to react to it. And every economy is suffering as a result of that. It's not like we're the only ones that are dealing with this. I read an interesting article. My colleague, Martha Kumar, who runs the White House Transition Project, was writing about the transition and interviewed Ted Kaufman, who was a former senator and also the head of the transition and a very close friend of President Biden. And the things that he said were key about that transition, I think, are actually things that can be translated as lessons to today as well, and leadership. One is, he said, one of the key things for the transition was to set a tone of professionalism and respect. And that, I think, is like a leadership lesson that actually can convey to almost any setting and into the future as well. He also said that they put a premium on paying attention to metrics. Whether you like it or not, you need to sort of track things. You need to have numerical analysis about how voters are responding or how effective policies are. You need to learn from those metrics. And he also mentioned the importance of, sorry, there was a third point that's just escaping me. Cybersecurity. And this is kind of just going towards the future, but in the campaign, they were very concerned about other foreign countries trying to infiltrate and to, tamper with the campaign, et cetera. But I thought all of those things were not just useful for the campaign in 2020, but those are useful ideas that I think going into the future, they're things that are always going to be with us and concerns that we should always have. But foremost among those, I think, is setting a tone, and that you hope that by setting a new tone, as the Biden administration has, even if they haven't been as successful as those who wanted the administration to be, at least the tone has changed, and we're not where we were a year plus ago. And that I would mark as progress and should give people hope as well.
Great. Well, we're down to our final minute. Maybe each of us could say, or each of you could say, what else gives you hope as we think about the end of this first year? Josh?
Every time I talk to groups of students, I get more hopeful, and I imagine that the students of Professors Solomon, McKee, Antholis, and Tempest are among them. But somewhat to my surprise, I find that the young people I talk to, who many of whom have a deep interest in public affairs and public policy, are not as cynical as I might expect. And that always gives me hope, because there needs to be a cleansing in our public discourse, and a return toward civility and common facts and the kind of respect that Katie was talking about. And I have found that uniformly among the young people I talk with. So the sooner they can take over, the better.
I think that's a great message to end on and theme to end on. I want to thank the panelists for being part of this conversation. And I think it's my duty now to pass it back to my dear friend, Bill Antholis.
Well, thank you, Ian, and to Valerie, Katie, Josh, and Gian. It's a fantastic conversation. I'm so thrilled that you were able to join us and that the audience was able to benefit from your wisdom the way that we all have. So thank you. Our next panel will turn to the foreign policy and national security dimensions of the president's first year in office. We are joined today, starting by Eric Edelman, who is a Miller Center practitioner, senior fellow, and a former holder of our James Schlesinger Distinguished Visiting Professorship. Eric retired as a career minister from the U.S. Foreign Service in 2009 after serving in senior positions at the Departments of State and Defense, as well as at the White House, including having served as ambassador to Finland and later to Turkey. I'm wearing today a sports coat that I first purchased when visiting Eric in the summer of 1998. Old coat, but it feels like yesterday when he had just started as ambassador to Finland. And my wife, Kristen Swacco, Finnish name, were I think his first guests at the ambassador's residence. So thanks to Trish for hosting us, as well as Eric. Eric, along with Elliot Cohen, is the co-host of the Shield of the Republic podcast, which is produced by the Bulwark in collaboration with the Miller Center, and we're really delighted about that. Please tune into that. Suzanne Maloney is the Vice President and Director of Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution, where I spent 10 years. She has vast experience and knowledge across the range of foreign policy issues, including a particular expertise on Iran and global energy issues. In addition to her government service, Suzanne has worked in the private energy sector as well. And it's a real honor to welcome Suzanne to the Miller Center for, I think, the first time. We're delighted to have you, and we just can't wait to bring you to Charlottesville in person, in real life. And then finally, Steve Morrison is the James R. Schlesinger Distinguished Professor at the Miller Center and a Senior Vice President at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, where he founded and directs its Global Health Policy Center. Steve combines a career in government service on Capitol Hill, USAID, and the State Department with being arguably, at least in my perspective, the leading think tank voice on global public health and infectious disease issues. And he originally hails from the borough of Florham Park in the great state of New Jersey. The panel will be moderated by my friend, former governing council member, Ann Compton, who served as White House correspondent for ABC News for 41 years. She was the White House correspondent from essentially the Ford administration until the first year of the Obama administration. That's 7 presidencies, including shouted questions from the Oval driveway behind the Oval Office, on the way to Air Force, on the way to Marine One, as well as in the briefing room and countless places. She was featured in HBO's wonderful documentary that also featured Josh Bolton about that day, 9/11, that we will never forget, and her circuitous ride with President George W. Bush as the country came to terms with that extraordinary first-year crisis. So with that, Ann, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Bill, thank you very, very much. And it was under your leadership, Bill, that the Miller Center did such an exhaustive study of all the vulnerabilities in a first year. And when it comes to foreign policy, every new president faces vulnerability and challenges that it's hard to get your mind around all of them. Thank you to our 3 panelists coming in. Eric, I'm going to start with you because this is not your first rodeo. You've been through several transitions and new administrations, Republican as well as Democrat. And I'm wondering if, as you look at what you see unfolding now with Team Biden, whether your first time, I believe, was it your first administration coming in at the very beginning during the Clinton years, whether you have seen lessons in history that are being missed now, whether there are ways in which this administration has stepped up to what it needs to do in terms of foreign policy. Eric?
Well, Ann, thank you. First, it's great to be here in this panel with you and with Suzanne and Steve, both of whom I've served on panels with before. And it's always great to be here with colleagues at the Miller Center, and great to see my former colleague in the White House, Josh Bolton, on the screen. For my sins in the Foreign Service, I actually went through 5 presidential transitions in one capacity or another. I think the Bush 41, the Reagan-Bush 41 transition actually in many ways was the bloodiest and most vicious. But the Clinton transition in 1993, which I went through in 2 positions. I was a Deputy Assistant Secretary in the Department of Defense for the first 3 months of that transition, which was very rocky under the leadership of Les Aspin, who was appointed as Secretary of Defense, but fired after 9 months in, which gives you some sense of how rocky that tenure was. But the first year of the Clinton administration was extraordinarily rocky. I mean, you had coming right out of the chute a kerfluffle over Don't Ask, Don't Tell, a presidential directive signed by President Clinton, which blew up and created a huge ruckus at the Department of Defense, soured his relations with the late Colin Powell probably permanently. You had the attempted assassination of George Bush, orchestrated by Saddam Hussein, that created a requirement for the Clinton administration to bomb Baghdad, which is something one of the last things they wanted to do. They were embroiled in the civil war in Bosnia, which President Clinton had actually campaigned somewhat to George H.W. Bush's right on Bosnia, arguing the case for liberal interventionism, but discovered upon entering office that it was much more complicated and difficult than he thought. That continued to bedeviled him for several years, but in the first year was very problematic. And I'm sure you'll remember Secretary of State Warren Christopher's lift and strike mission to meet with the Allies in the spring of 1993 that went extremely poorly, in part because although our allies say that they want us to consult with them, and the Clinton administration took them at their word, frequently want us to tell them what they should do about something, as opposed to merely consult and offer alternatives. They had the Haiti situation, in which a U.S. warship was turned away by club-wielding thugs. So it was a very, very rocky first year for the Clinton administration. Now, the Biden administration, I think, had one huge advantage over the Clinton administration, which is the Democratic Party in 1993 had been out of office for 12 years. And so it entered office with a lot of people in place who were extremely inexperienced in national security affairs. Now, that is not the case with the Biden administration, but there has been a problem. Some of it not the Biden administration's fault, but some of it, which I think has been their fault, and that is the staffing of the national security bureaucracy. They've been very slow to get people into place. In part, that's because they've been sabotaged by the Josh Hawley, Ted Cruz blockade of nominations of ambassadors in the United States Senate. But it's not purely the doing of Hawley and Cruz. The administration has not put forward a nominee, for instance, to Kiev to be ambassador in Ukraine, which is astonishing considering that we had a situation in Ukraine in the spring. We obviously have a very serious one brewing now at the end of the year. No nominee. The administration has said that it is prioritizing strategic competition with China, or they like, I think, to put it, long-term competition with China. But we have no ambassador in Thailand or Vietnam or the Philippines, 2 treaty allies and 1 close partner in any strategy for dealing with China. We have no ambassador in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, no ambassador in Qatar. So this is, I think, a real problem that's bedeviled the administration. And then finally, their shakedown cruise has also been, I think, rougher than they anticipated. I think the administration came in hoping to prioritize China, put most other issues on the back burner, quickly get back into the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, give Putin some attention with the summit to hopefully be able to park those issues and then concentrate on China. That's not the way it's worked. And of course, most seriously, the debacle in Afghanistan, I think, has been a huge problem for them, both in terms of conduct of foreign policy, but also in terms of the president's political standing. I think somebody, maybe Ian, mentioned in the previous panel the Quinnipiac poll showing the president, down 20 points. I think it's worth noting that if you look at the chart of that poll, the point at which he went negative and got underwater politically coincides with the debacle in Afghanistan. Correlation is not necessarily causation, but I think there's a relationship.
Well, this is exactly where I want to move to Suzanne. Suzanne, of the options that the team Biden, especially the inner core that he did have with him at the White House, at State Department, did they make smart choices of where they wanted to move? And are there some oversights that are going to be regrettable in the long run?
Thanks, Anne, and I'm really so glad to be here virtually with the Miller Center and look forward to someday actually making it down to Charlottesville. It's you've brought together such a phenomenal group of experts, and so I'm really just honored to be here amongst them, learning so much. I really want to echo some of what Eric has just said. I think the administration came in with a very clear set of priorities, which is absolutely essential to getting things done in a first year of a presidency. Even with the kind of overshadowing of this, very disruptive and, sort of unprecedented moment in history in terms of both the pandemic and the domestic political crisis, what you saw was, I think, a concerted effort to be very clear about what was most important for U.S. foreign policy and national security, and that was the strategic competition, primarily with China. They did this in a way, I think, that reinforced the kind of efforts to bring in very experienced people. There are no stretch assignments on the foreign policy team of the Biden administration. These are all people who know their brief, who've worked together extensively. It's a president who has more foreign policy experience than any of his recent predecessors. And so in many respects, I think they came in a real position of strength and deserve a lot of credit for being very clear about both the priorities and the importance of having the right team in place. But I think, as Eric foreshadowed, you can't control what others do. You can't really anticipate fully how your adversaries in particular are going to read the tea leaves and take advantage of what they perceive to be both opportunities and, in some cases, weakness from the United States. And I think that's what the administration has struggled to respond effectively with. In that sense, I think when it comes to the Middle East, they were very clearly trained on the need to get back as quickly as possible to full compliance with the Iran nuclear deal. As one issue that they could move off the front burner and try to bring down the temperature in the Middle East. They were to some extent caught off guard when there was a flare-up of tensions between Israelis and Palestinians, and yet handled that, I think, very effectively with very intense and personal diplomacy on the part of the president and senior administration officials. What they, of course, have, I think, been challenged by is, as I said, this difficulty to ensure that all the rest of the players on the world stage are singing from the same sheet of music. And so there has been this long-range effort to try to work diplomatically to bring the Iran nuclear deal back into full compliance that has not yet succeeded. And they're coming under increasing domestic pressure as a result. As Eric said, I think, this very clear prioritization, once again, to begin to draw down the American presence in Afghanistan makes perfect sense on paper in terms of where our true national interests lie, and of course makes perfect sense from the perspective of American domestic politics, given that we see majorities from both parties really that are fairly weary of the extensive engagement, particularly in Middle Eastern wars. But I think here too, they failed to anticipate how quickly that Kabul would fall, that the Afghan national government was not capable of sustaining itself without the critical assistance that the American military provided. I think that was a very disturbing moment because it demonstrated both a failure to do some of the things that the Biden administration had really made as its hallmarks. This was the return of the grown-ups, people, as I said, very experienced. And what you saw with Afghanistan was this sense of chaos in American decision-making, the failure to fully plan, and also a failure to fully coordinate with our closest partners and allies that had themselves expended, considerable diplomatic, political capital, and blood and treasure in terms of their own involvement in Afghanistan. And I do think that, while Afghanistan has fallen from the headlines, while it's not clear that the average American cares deeply about this issue, I think that it very much hurt the narrative of the Biden administration that they had a plan, that they were following through on that plan, and that it was going to make Americans both safer and more prosperous. Add to that all the complications of the pandemic, and I think we find ourselves today not in the position of strength that might have been the case.
Do you think Afghanistan, the execution of the Afghan withdrawal, encouraged people like Vladimir Putin and have encouraged Beijing?
I think adversaries all around the world watched what the American government was doing and recognized that this administration was reading its own public and wanted to ensure that it avoided another extended and protracted conflict in the broader Middle East and South Asia. And certainly the Iranians read the tea leaves and understood the lesson from that. And I think that has contributed to their recalcitrance at the bargaining table. I think that both Putin and Xi have taken the measure of this administration. They understand where the priorities are, but they also see real opportunities, and they're taking advantage of them all around the world.
Yeah. And very quickly, are there some opportunities or issues on the global scene that have been overlooked and that they will come to regret that?
I think, one of them, and I assume that the next speaker is going to address this, is really this confusion early on about whether or not we were, as a country, going to invest in ensuring that the entire world was vaccinated. And that came up early with India, but I think we see it once again with the emergence of Omicron, and now this sense among many Americans that we don't know when the next strain is going to hit, and so we're very much captive to a virus that is, politicized at home, but also one in which it very much influenced by dynamics that happen beyond our borders.
Perfect way to segue now to Steve. Steve, is there any issue like this pandemic that has so brought together the importance of national security on a global scale, and an issue that comes right into every American kitchen and family room, every school room, every office? You are coming here today. You have brought us some recommendations from your organization, suggestions on what might be done now. Please, Steve, share that with us.
Thank you so much, Anne, and thanks to Bill for the opportunity to be here, and to Suzanne and Eric to be together in this panel. There's been some really tough lessons this year from COVID, and the picture is very mixed, obviously, in terms of what was accomplished in terms of U.S. leadership. There's been some achievements, but there's also been a lot of disappointment and frustration and continued uncertainty. Simply getting out of the Trump era, getting out of 2020 was a radical change, but we also inherited an enormous deficit on the global response created by Trump. And we can talk more about that, but overcoming that, rebuilding where the G7, the G20, the UN Security Council had basically been paralyzed, where the US China confrontation had escalated, We had broken our ties to World Health Organization. We had already politicized that and closed off any cooperation with the Chinese. When we came in, there was a hesitation to get too active internationally in the first 2 quarters of 2020. The president was focused overwhelmingly on getting the domestic vaccine campaign up and running and was resistant to even talking much about what the international strategy would look like, thinking that we would hit a pivot in the spring and summer where there would be this turn towards normality. You remember the president's speech about July 4th and the like. Well, lo and behold, of course, Delta interrupted that vision and upended it. We went back into a new wave. Omicron comes in later and does that. So we certainly didn't anticipate how disruptive the virus and the variants were going to be. The president, in a somewhat ad hoc and abrupt manner, went to the G7 in early June, committed to 500 million doses of Pfizer towards low and middle income countries through the COVAX vaccine sharing.
This is now President Biden.
Yes, President Biden
2021.
takes this major step, the first really big step internationally, commits to an arsenal, being the arsenal of vaccines for the world. That was an important step. But and then moving forward, we get to the September 22nd summit that the president called on the margins of the UN General Assembly. Again, another second 500 million dose commitment and a commitment to doing another summit in the first quarter of this year. So they lay down some commitments in terms of vaccine donations. We had in our pocket $19 billion of emergency supplemental funding to spend. We've spent that out for the most part. And we've certainly done far more than what other governments have done. But there's a couple of really tough lessons here. First of all, we don't have a strategy. We don't have a multi-year budget and set of goals. It's not clear who's in charge. It's fairly ad hoc, and the response has not been scaled to what the true demand is. We're discovering just how difficult it is to find wealthy and well-endowed partners to work with us. Yes. We're coming up very shorthanded. And of course, we haven't figured out at all how to dialogue with the Chinese on any of this.
Right.
So, and we've discovered that, as you point out, these variants are driving the story. And we have to take those all into account and recalculate and recalibrate. In the midst of all of this, the vaccine inequities between the most wealthy and the most powerful versus the 90 or so low and middle income countries have for the most part worsened in this period, particularly among a group of about 40 countries that are falling farther and farther behind. And the drive towards boosters, the drive in the wealthy countries, the drive towards vaccinating children, the uncertainty around what the next vaccine regimen is going to look like is leading to renewed hoarding and the like, and a projection that in this coming year, there will be a 3 billion vaccine dose gap between what is needed in those low and middle income countries. So we're not out of the woods yet. We don't have a strong diplomatic capacity to guide US efforts. And we don't have a strategy and budget and targets in this period. We've done some very good work, but it's been very ad hoc.
And the kind of cooperation that the United States needs to lead with other countries, other world organizations, you mentioned the WHO, and the United Nations, this is not something the United States ever had a chance of really doing all by itself. Has President Biden kind of missed the boat now on bringing in a much stronger global response?
Well, I think there has to be a redoubled diplomatic effort at bringing others on board. Some of what the U.S. has done has rescued COVAX. The COVAX facility was rescued through U.S. intervention, committing 1 billion doses of Pfizer, a $7 billion investment in COVAX facility. That has stabilized that organization. The U.S. is putting more muscle slowly against Moderna and Pfizer in terms of turning their attention towards low and middle income countries. They were very late to do that, but they're moving in that direction. The Global Fund to Fight HIV, TB, and Malaria, which has been very aggressive and very active at meeting the non-vaccine requirements, protective gear, testing, oxygen. The U.S. put $3.5 billion into extra in the emergency into the Global Fund and helped it expand its engagement. So there are some bright spots. We've restored our relationship to the World Health Organization. We've joined an intergovernmental diplomatic effort that is looking at what kind of new pandemic agreement might be struck that will strengthen WHO and begin to look at these equity issues. So there is a diplomatic process. We won't see the returns for another 2 years or so.
You recently, but 48 hours ago, sat down with Dr. Anthony Fauci. Is this a moment of real shift? Does he see it that way as well?
I think a lot of people are looking at what's happening with Omicron and making the argument that, yes, indeed, we are likely at a transition point in this pandemic, but it's still wrapped in a lot of uncertainty and unknowns. But what the fundamental argument is that this Omicron is creating, it's so fast and it's so vaccine evasive that it is running way ahead of the controls, and it is creating mass infection and mass immunity from infection along with the vaccine acquired infection, so that we have a wall out there that is forcing changes in the virus itself, and is likely, after we get over the other side of the worst of this surge right now, we will be entering a new phase, and we have to still be very conscious of the next variant. We have to deal with a number of other unknowns, but that we are likely entering a period where we can begin to think about moving out of emergency and into managing the virus in different forms. But we have to guard against the desire to say, oh, it's just a cough, or we're going to soon just treat it as some normal thing. It's still going to be a threat in our environment, but there is a lot of rethinking going on. We saw the members of the Biden Transition Advisory Group, Zeke Emanuel and others, issue a number of papers last week. And there are a number of other very prominent people who are making this argument, including Tony Fauci.
Yeah. Let me ask all three of you, and I'm going to start with you, Suzanne. The question that, as a journalist, I think isn't answered in or asked enough here in Washington is why all of this has happened. Suzanne, why do you think this first year has been so difficult for Joe Biden, who'd been a creature of Washington, creature of Congress, who knew the ropes, and many people felt he was kind of an island of stability now after the tumultuous administration that preceded him? Why has this been such a difficult year for the Biden administration? Suzanne?
It's a great question. I think there are some reasons that reflect on the administration itself and its own decision making. There are some reasons that reflect on the context of Washington policy making. But there's the bigger questions of the international environment and the context for U.S. foreign policy. And I think we are very much at a sort of pivotal moment in history, and this is a transition that would be exceptionally difficult to manage for any administration under almost any circumstances. So let me just back up and speak a little bit about the factors within the administration. As I said, incredibly experienced team, really talented people who'd spent the past 4 years, both criticizing the Trump administration, but also thinking very carefully about the kind of policy priorities that they would seek to implement if they were lucky enough to get back into the White House. And so they had a really coherent game plan, but I think there is a question of, this best and brightest sort of factor where they really know the answer, they understand what needs to be done, and I think that there has not been enough sort of outside the box thinking and listening that is always necessary for any administration, even in its first year, even one that is as experienced and as thoughtful as this one. And so I think that's just one factor. In terms of the context in Washington, as Eric said, we are very much in an unprecedented situation in terms of the appointment process and the fact that there are dozens of people who are waiting for their confirmation. We don't have senior officials at many of the bureaus in the State Department. We don't have ambassadors in key locations. Some of this is, much of this is directly a function of our domestic political polarization. Some of it, of course, is attributable to the administration itself. But I think that's been a real drag on the efficacy of the administration when they're trying to manage so many crises with interim officials or with sort of holes on the roster. But finally, just to come back to the broader moment, I do think that this is an exceptionally challenging time. First, the pandemic. Second, the disruption and chaos of the Trump period, in which there were deep divisions left between the United States and some of its core partners, and there were many other countries that I think saw opportunities and have sought to exploit them. But it is a moment in history in which the sort of balance of power is changing, and the United States is now no longer a unitary superpower. We are very much in a deep competition. The Biden administration has a theory of the case, which is that we can rally the free world, so to speak, or the community of democracies, and that we can outperform the Chinese and the Russians and others. But as we saw with some of the initiatives of the administration, we're facing a real challenge in terms of trying to implement that, and we're also facing very determined adversaries that have a lot of advantages in places where the United States historically had clear strengths. I don't think that this is the end of the story, but I think that this is a monumentally important historical moment, the likes of which we haven't seen in decades.
And I see you nodding, Eric. Can you pick up on that, on the why this has been so tough?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I really didn't hear a word that Suzanne said that I disagree with. I do think the administration both overestimated and underestimated some things. I mean, I think they overestimated their ability to navigate the very, very difficult domestic politics that we find ourselves in at this moment that Suzanne mentioned, and that Guillen mentioned in the first panel as well. I agree with him. I think that they misread the mood of the electorate and what the electorate was looking for. I mean, I suppose that's pretty typical going back as I think about, the transitions I went through before, but in this instance, there were some counter indicators that should have led them to pause. I mean, Biden won the, presidency by, 8 million votes, but the results in the House were clear disappointment to the Democrats and gave them a very, very narrow margin in the House. That should have been an indication to them that they needed to, proceed with some caution. And my own, view of what the electorate was saying was they were sick of Trump. They were sick of the tweets and the drama and the firings and everything that Katie mentioned in her remarks in the first panel. They were looking for someone who was a safe pair of hands, who would be a competent manager of the national interest and would get the pandemic, under control. And I think what happened was that they did interpret this as, potential Rooseveltian or Lyndon Johnson moment where they could transform the country. I think that did incline them, as Josh said in the first panel, to overreach. And I think, as I said earlier, I think their image of competence was very badly damaged, both by the execution of the Afghanistan withdrawal and by the resurgence of the Delta variant in the summer after the president had given his speech saying that we were going to be independent, from the virus on July 4th, which I think was very ill-considered. I think they also underestimated the institutional damage that had been done to the government by the Trump administration, both in the State Department and in the Defense Department.
They saw it, but didn't understand how deep and the impact running very, very deep.
Yeah, I think if you have essentially disestablished a normal interagency process, and for 4 years people have not been engaged in the normal kind of operations of government, to think that everything just snaps back to the status quo ante because you've been sworn in on January 20th is probably a mistake. And I think in this case it was a mistake. And because of the voids that were created in a variety of parts of the government, lack of sub-cabinet officers at state, at defense, and elsewhere, power began to be concentrated, in the White House and in the NSC in particular, and I think that led to some of the difficulties and the dysfunction. Honestly, one thing that's very striking about this team, it's a very experienced team. They're all good people. A number of them are longtime personal friends of mine. But I also think it's fair to say that most of them are very personally connected to Biden and have served Biden in subordinate staff roles in the past. And the ability to challenge the president, challenge his assumptions, in particular on the Afghanistan decision, I think was lacking. And to stress test some of the assumptions that they were operating under. Now, to be fair, press accounts suggest that Jake Sullivan, relatively late in the spring, started to have some questions and second thoughts about the speed of the withdrawal that DOD was recommending. But much like the Kennedy administration with the Bay of Pigs, there wasn't really an adequate, testing of the hypothesis, I think, which led to the debacle. And so I think all of those things were in play.
I want to get to some of the excellent questions coming in, and I may go to those a little bit earlier than I expected. Please, those of you who do have questions for our panels, put them in now, and we will get to as many as we can. Let me start with this one. These are from the students who have, for the last 2 weeks, have been studying all this and doing interviews across Washington. The question from the students is, after the fallout in Afghanistan, how can we reestablish the confidence of our allies and deter adversaries such as China and Russia from taking advantage of a weak perception of the presidential leader, the American leadership on the geopolitical stage? Let me start, Suzanne, with you, and then I'm going to go to Steve. Suzanne?
It's a great question. I don't think there's a sort of magic formula to it. I think it's persistent engagement and consultation. And I should note it wasn't just Afghanistan that led to at least some loss of faith by some of our allies. We saw a little bit of fallout, particularly from the French, over a tripartite agreement between the Australians, the United States, and the UK and the Japanese for a kind of new alliance managing the challenge from China. So this has been, I think, something that the administration has very much struggled with. This issue of how to ensure that there are real consultations. And that, in fact, we take the opinions and the political and diplomatic priorities of our partners and allies into consideration with the decisions that we're making. I worry that there was such a sense of relief when President Biden came into office by so many people really across the world and across the political spectrum, even here in the United States. And when he went to the Munich Security Conference in early 2020 and said, America's back, there was, I think, a desire for that to be enough. And I think what we've learned over the course of the past year is that you have to walk the walk as much as talk the talk. And often that slows you down. Often that means that, your perfect conception of what the right policy should be needs to be adjusted in order to incorporate the concerns of partners and allies. But in effect, it's absolutely necessary. And in fact, we do see the administration doing this in many other parts of the world. But these core allies, Europe and our allies across Asia, are going to be essential partners in this strategic competition, and we can't go it alone. The president understands that, and I think that we're just going to have to really invest in those relationships.
Let me turn to Steve on that. Isn't leadership in terms of COVID globally something that could help reestablish the confidence and deter those who would be antagonistic to the administration?
I certainly think so. I mean, what we've come forward with is to say, look, we need something comparable to the president's emergency plan for AIDS relief. We need a major global initiative of multi-year. We need designated presidential leadership around that. We need to indicate that we're going to get really serious over an extended period of time of building the capacities of our regional partners and of key countries that are in greatest need, and that we will deliver on that. And I think that would also be paired with the notion that we are going to do what is needed in order to bring the technological innovations that are coming forward from industry to the benefit of the broader world, and that we're going to attack frontally the inequities that are driving down U.S. standing in the world, quite frankly. So I agree in that. I wanted to just say a couple other things that I think are needed in terms of rebuilding. There's been a lot of talk about Afghanistan, and I agree with what Suzanne and Eric said. I would add that Afghanistan is not over, and it has generated the largest human crisis in the world at the moment. Just this week, we had the $5 billion appeal come forward, the largest appeal in history for a humanitarian crisis. The United States is being held to account, if not blamed for that reality, fairly or not fairly, but it is a lingering aftermath consequence that is reputationally hurting the United States and creating a dangerous and destabilizing reality that is frightening the entire region and Europe, which sees it as spawning the next out-migration crisis. And we're seeing that unfold. So we cannot take our eye off of that humanitarian crisis. There have been steps taken to begin to ameliorate it, but the key liquidity and finance sector challenges have not been solved, and the United States is at the very center of that. The last thing I want to say is that we can't underestimate the degree to which our democratic crisis at home is changing the outlook and perspective of the rest of the world. This dysfunctionality, threat of continued violence, the polarization, the assault upon democratic institutions that's unfolding in front of our eyes is lowering our legitimacy. It's lowering the predictability of America. And that dynamic at home is spilling into the way in which the rest of the world is looking upon us. I agree with Suzanne. I don't know what the quick fix is to that. I don't think there is one, but we need to admit to ourselves that our democratic crisis is threatening our sway, our predictability, our influence in being able to answer that question about how do we restore trust, confidence, and sway in the world.
Because that's exactly the kind of issue that the president would have the greatest trouble with moving through the current Congress.
Correct.
Yeah. Let me get into a couple more questions in the minutes that we have left, and we can come back to this idea of the democratic crisis. I would like to finish up on that. Susan asks, what about the immigration crisis Biden has faced, especially regarding the treatment of Haitian immigrants? How does this square with the priorities of the new administration? Would anyone like to try that? Immigration, I think, on a broad scale has been very difficult. Eric?
Well, I think this is just one of a series of issues on which the administration has, counted again. This goes back to my earlier point about underestimating and overestimating the challenges. I think they overestimated the degree to which they would come into office, and because they were not, the Trump administration, they would be able to, manage things with great ease. Immigration is one of those issues. I think inflation is, fears of inflation is another, and crime is yet another issue, as well as the disruption to education that took place as a result of the pandemic. I think on all of those issues, they basically did not think that they were problems that they had to wrestle with. And particularly in immigration, the crisis on the border, the drive from Central America. I mean, Vice President Harris was sort of sent down there, to sort of try and go to Central America, try and stop some of the flow that was coming in. I sort of like King Canute. I don't know how people thought she was going to do that. That just, by making some statement, it was going to stop the flow of immigrants. But I think the administration gave off an aura of these are not real problems. These are problems being created by your colleagues in the Fourth Estate, and not something that they had to worry about. And I think they're paying a huge price in public opinion for that.
Yeah. Don't get me started on the Fourth Estate right now. We have one quick question that I do want to get in. Hang on. From Jeffrey Krasny asking Ambassador Edelman, noting the lack of nominees for ambassadors in critical countries, is the Biden administration, he asks, seeking the perfect candidate rather than a really good potential nominee for those vacancies? Is it just the Congress and the Senate complexion that's holding up the nominations and confirmations? Eric?
Well, I wish I could give you an answer to that question. I'm really, I'm not privy to what Kathy Russell has been doing in PPO, the Presidential Personnel Office in the White House, to vet these candidates. I mean, I suspect some of it is the difficulty of vetting candidates, because it is harder and harder with every turn of administration to get people who are willing to go through what you have to go through to be nominated and confirmed by the Senate for a presidentially appointed position. Some of it is also balancing, sort of the demands of donors who see these, positions as payback for, large campaign contributions in that sense. And I don't mean to single out the Biden administration. This has been true of every administration. But, in many ways, we're not far beyond or advanced the period of time in Watergate, which, Ann, you will remember well, as I do, when President Nixon on the Watergate tape said, if someone wants to go to Luxembourg, it's going to be $350,000. And if they want to go to one of the really good embassies, it's going to be $450,000. I mean, we're not that far away from that, unfortunately. And that's something that people have had to wrestle with. Look, State Department morale is actually, less good than one might anticipate, in the wake of the unlamented secretaryships of Rex Tillerson and Mike Pompeo. And one of the reasons is a lot of people came back into the administration who'd left government service in 2017. And there are a lot of people at State who are saying, well, so what's the payoff for those of us who stayed in and soldiered on and tried to provide some continuity and protect the country from some of the crazy ideas that were being floated by people in the Trump administration? So they're trying to wrestle, I think, with all of those things. And I suspect that's what's creating some of the holdup.
Suzanne, the same thing might be asked about cabinet and sub-cabinet positions. Has the administration, which has, as we heard, has a remarkable new bottom line on diversity within cabinets and in appointed positions, do you get the sense that they're trying too hard to find new faces, new voices to come in, and that too is slowing down, pulling in the kind of personnel that the administration needs across the government?
I don't actually see that as a real issue. In fact, I think the administration has made just enormous strides in changing the nature of our senior officialdom. There is just the statistics are startling. The number of women, the number of people of color who are serving in critical positions. It sounds, sort of to much of the American population like something that is very much to be expected. But even when I go back and look at the photos of the policy planning staff that I served in during the second term of the Bush administration, and see how few women were part of some of the senior levels of government, even 10 or 15 years ago, we are very much in a different era. And I think it's one that reflects America today, and it's incredibly important. So I genuinely believe that the administration has done a phenomenal job of tapping talent, of identifying people who really had the capacity and experience to serve, and giving them the opportunity to do that, and they deserve huge credit for it.
Right. So in the minutes we've got left, I would like to ask all three of you to address two things. One is what you mentioned a moment ago, our democratic crisis at home. How is that challenging the Biden administration in its global dealings in the year coming ahead? Let's start thinking forward to the second year, or the rest of the term, especially because it is a political year in the United States with the congressional elections. Can you, I'll start with you, Suzanne, address the kind of world attitudes toward the United States and toward the Biden administration, considering how difficult the democracy under attack and the political divisions within the United States government, how that has hurt and challenged the Biden administration?
Sure, I will just try to give you a sense of what the world looks like from a place like Tehran, but I think it's a view that is not terribly dissimilar from the view of Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin, which is this long-standing assumption that they are in a position of strength, that the United States is a waning power, very much debilitated by its own internal divisions, that it is incapable of asserting itself and carrying out its will on the world stage, just as it is laden at home and very much divided in terms of its ability to get things done within the country. And what they've seen really since 2016 with the election of Donald Trump is a narrative that very much legitimates their preconceived notions. And so, it's one that they can sell. It's one that they sell to their own people, but also increasingly they are weaponizing through disinformation around the world to try to undermine both our own kind of internal cohesion as well as our position and our reputation around the world. So I think it is a real issue, and it is a real issue in the sense that it also impacts our ability to get things done at home, because you have these divides, because you have politicians who are willing to put holds on dozens of senior officials rather than traditionally, as would be done, go through the confirmation process. Finally, I think it also creates a particular problem for this administration because President Biden has put such an emphasis on democracy. He organized this very high profile, yet had to be virtual summit for democracy back in December. There is a presumption that we have to rally the world's democracies to deal with the challenge of authoritarianism. And yet when we see the difficulties that we face at home, I think it really raises questions among even our closest and most longest standing allies about our ability to succeed with that agenda.
No, thank you, Suzanne. Let me turn to you, Steve, in terms of what the world is looking for from the Biden administration in the year ahead and ways in which that American sense of leadership can be rebuilt.
Well, I want to add a comment onto what Suzanne said, which is we haven't talked enough about disinformation, misinformation, conspiracy theories, poison social media, and the consequences and the erosion of trust and confidence here at home in authority and science and the like. And it's a factor in that 33% number, frankly. And it's a factor in the massive confusion in the way that people are walking away from listening to basic guidance from our own authorities at CDC and FDA when we're talking about the COVID response. We face a similar problem in our communications and the delivery of what are our core messages and our goals, and what are we prepared to deliver in going out to the world and making that case. I think the president's speech on the anniversary of January 6th was a powerful and very dramatic and clear set of messages that were bold and to the point. And I think we need more of that in the way that we address the rest of the world. We need a bit of humility, but we also need some clear goals in this next phase that demonstrate that the United States is moving forward and making very serious new commitments. We've talked about COVID, but it's not just COVID. It's a multitude of other issues. I also get back to the point that was made at the outset. This is a world beset by multiple crises. There's not easy wins out there, but we can show resolve and we can show clarity and creativity and appeal to the best values of American commitments here in terms of ethical and moral leadership, security leadership, and trying to reopen this world and restore prosperity.
Thank you. And Eric, I'll give you the last word, looking toward 2022.
Well, I think the thing that's going to be, front and center is going to be the ongoing crisis in Ukraine. If that eventuates in an actual Russian invasion of Ukraine, a massive military.
Do you think it will? Do you think there will?
I've been very skeptical that Putin really wants to, bite this off. I think it would be an enormous roll of the dice and could blow back on him very badly, much as the Soviet intervention in Afghanistan in 1979 actually set in train a process that led to the dissolution of the Soviet Union a decade or so later. My crystal ball is a little cloudy. I mean, Russians I talk to who, like me, share a certain skepticism are not completely certain, though, that he hasn't painted himself into a corner that he can't get himself out of. And I think that's going to shape a lot of what happens in 22. If we can get by this with a de-escalation, then some of the other agenda items that Steve and Suzanne have talked about can come back to the fore. But if there's a serious war in Ukraine, that will, I think, begin to overshadow almost everything else that the administration does. I do want to say that I think, to the earlier question of how does the U.S. reassert leadership and what the administration can do in 2022, I agree with Suzanne that the AUKUS was a kind of own goal on the alliance management front that reinforced mostly for the French, but to some degree other Europeans, the sense that the United States was not consulting sufficiently with its allies. But I will say that I give the administration high marks for following the sort of dictum of my late former boss, George Shultz, who said that alliance management is like gardening. It requires constant tending. And I think Secretary Blinken, Secretary Sherman, Jake Sullivan, Secretary Austin have actually invested a great deal of time in working with the allies and trying to keep them all on side. And I think they're going to have to continue to do that into 2022 to overcome this, set of worries and concerns that's been created by the events of 2021.
Well, our time is up, and I want to thank so much our panelists, Eric Edelman, Steve Morrison, and Suzanne Maloney, and the Miller Center for hosting this today, the look at the first year of the Biden administration and the wisdom and thought-provoking ideas that you have brought to us today. Thank you all for joining us, and best of luck to those students of Bill's and David's who've been working on this exact issue for the last 2 weeks. Thank you for joining us from the Miller Center.